Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergui. Welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi. We talk to all kinds of interesting people through a spiritual lens on this program. And, we kind of go sideways whenever we want to. But there's been some very interesting souls that have arrived on this particular program. And I've always enjoyed talking to them. We just recently had Bob Ray on the show. We've also had Tar Sloan on the show. All kinds of different personalities who you don't really think about their spiritual lives because you know them for what they do in the world, not what they be in the world. So I always find that interesting. Full disclosure, I come at it from a Jewish lens. I'm an ordained spiritual director, but I'm not a rabbi. Okay, so let's not go there because then I'll get some phone call from some official rabbi outfit that'll say, "You're not a rabbi? That you nuts?" And I don't want that. I don't want, like a Lubavitcher van to show up outside my house and, put decals on my front window saying not a rabbi. So I just have to clarify that before I start the shows. One of the people I've been friends with for a long time, but always wanted to have a conversation about the spiritual side of life as well as the artistic side of life is one of this country's finest musicians, Juno Award winner, a collaborator par excellence. He has always found a way to mix beautiful kinds of musics together and bring them into a whole new light by doing so. And a very talented trumpeter as well. He's played the horn in my home, so I can vouch for that one. His name is David Buchbinder, and he joins me now. Hello, Mr. Buchbinder.
Hello, Mr. Rabbi Benmergui. How are you?
Rebbe to you, buddy. Clinically, rabbi just means teacher.
I don't know.
Right?
And you are nothing if not that.
Yeah. All right, Kansas City. Like, I thought you were from St. Louis, Missouri, but you're from Kansas City, Missouri. Am I right?
Well, I didn't spend a lot of time there. We left when I was 6 months old. So
6 months?
Yeah, so I have no memory of it. And did go. I remember being 6 years old and going back there with my mother and brother to visit family friends. But other than that, I've never been there.
So you grew up in St. Louis?
St. Louis until I was around 10, then we came here. So yeah, St. Louis definitely had a big impact. And actually, I don't know if we'll get into talking about this, but sort of the life that my parents were living, and I guess by extension that we were living, was quite eventful in a relatively short period of time. So I feel like I had a lot of.
Come on.
I had a lot of St. Louis impact on my life. Put it that way.
All right. So what do you mean by eventful?
Well, so I'm such an old guy that when I was a kid, it was right in the middle of the 60s. I grew up, I was born in the tail end of 59. And my parents were very involved. I could say politically involved, but kind of involved in everything. So they were certainly involved in the anti-war movement. They were involved in the civil rights movement. My father, I believe, marched on Selma with Martin Luther King, and his work. He was trained as a social worker, but his work took him into anti-poverty programs. So he was working in different underserved communities in St. Louis and East St. Louis, and I think also in West Virginia. He used to go there. So there was that aspect. My mother got involved in the very early feminist movement, I guess second wave feminist movement. And we even had key people in the St. Louis, or who came to St. Louis for political reasons, both the first organizer of the SDS in St. Louis, and then later the organizers of the first grape boycott from the United Farm Workers. Both those folks lived in our house. So that all of this together, and then on top of it, going to regular events in the kind of political, cultural community had a huge impact on me as well. I'd say probably even more of an impact, like the happenings and the rock bands and the light shows and, a lot more stuff like that. So I think both in terms of a sense of a world where change is possible and where change is a really high value. Its value to make positive change in the world was something that my parents didn't just talk about, but shared with us.
What was that like? I mean, I've always wondered, certainly didn't grow up that way, but I've always wondered what would it have been like as a child to see these people come and go? How much of what they were and what they were about at the time did rub off on you in that time? And how did you feel as a child in that?
Well, and it's a great question, Ralph, but I would say that, and this is kind of my orientation anyway, that my point of entry to them was as them as people. I mean, I was, if you're talking about those folks, I was, was probably between the ages of 7 and 9, where I was really, or 6 and 9, where I was connected with them, and actually through the two. Well, actually, the first guy is, since we have time, I'll take a little discursion and say that the guy who worked for the SDS was a guy who came from New York.
What's the SDS for people?
Oh, SDS was the Students for Democratic Society,
right,
founded in Port Huron, Michigan in 1964, and it was the central student or youth form of mobilizing against the war. I think they were looking at, in their original statement, it was about how to transform society, but the core of their activity was an anti-war activity. So,
all right, so this guy from the
SDS came from, and he was a fascinating guy. He was like Zelig-like kind of guy who was, he was there for everything, right? He ended up being part of the early gay rights movement. He was there at Stonewall, and then completely sort of out of left field, he also turns out, and I didn't know this when I was a kid. This kind of came clear many, many years later, but he turns out he was an incredible whistler. He was such an amazing whistler that in later years he would whistle opera with symphony orchestras, and he whistled. I can't remember what was the name of the bird in Charlie Brown and the Charlie Brown animated specials.
Woodstock.
Woodstock. He whistled for Woodstock. He was Woodstock basically, and Anyway, I didn't know that at the time, but he came and and he was probably 19 or 20. And so I was 7 or 8. My brother was a year older, and so he and then the other folks who came with the Great Boycott were a couple. In fact, I think his name was Matt. I can't remember her name, and he was like a working class farm, kind of kid who grew up with his parents picking, and she was at the time was called Mexican American, which then became Chicano. Whose family was also involved, and they were a couple, and they came and stayed. So with those three, and then also the people around them, because their friends would come to the house, they were people, right? And they were interested in us, and my brother and I were pretty engaged, so we knew how to hang out around adults, I think. So we were interesting in a way, I think, and because we were interested in what they were doing. So it was a social thing as much as anything, but it was also, I feel like I got an imprint of people who were living what they believed in. And that was something you could taste, that wasn't just an idea, it was a experience.
Yeah. So what informed your parents, fueled your parents in social justice? Did it come from a Jewish perspective, or was just secular?
Well, both. I mean, they were the perfect example of left-wing American atheists, Jews, and we went to shul. Like that. We didn't once we came to Toronto, but in St. Louis, we went to B'nai Amuna, and I went to I went to Hebrew school there, sort of after regular school, a couple times a week. Just as an aside, and we'll probably get into talking about this, I've been living on and off in New Orleans, and in fact, it was coronavirus chased me out of there, last month, but on my way down in February, I went back to St. Louis, and just to go and see it. I haven't seen it since I was 17 because we went down to visit then. And so I saw all these places. So yeah, B'nai Amuna Synagogue, which is now Art Center. And
how did you feel when you were there in St. Louis?
It was amazing. We'll talk about that in a sec if we want to, but just to focus on this so I don't lose my train, basically. Yeah. I think they came from slightly different backgrounds. My father's from New York, and his parents were, relatively secular. They're incredibly Jewish culturally, but I don't feel like synagogue going was a big part of their thing. They just lived and breathed Jewish life and culture, right? All their friends were Jewish. They were, both of my grandfathers were immigrants from Europe, one when he was 3, the other when he was 18, and both grandmothers were born in the States. So my mother's side, they were modern Orthodox. And so she grew up in that world very much. And I think I'm not like, it's interesting, right? On my father's side, it's very clear to see there was no direct social justice roots in terms of family. He was a bit of the black sheep of their family. Everybody else was very mainstream American and very much about business and kind of like assimilating. And I don't just mean in a Jewish sense. I mean in terms of the consumer life and the kind of just taking that as a given, sort of the mainstream culture, whereas he was always looking at it from the outside. And I think he kind of had that natural bent somehow, but I think he was also, both of them were, I wouldn't say radicalized, but they were politicized by the left-wing Zionist movement. So, and that's where they met. So the kibbutz related Zionist movement, which for them, certainly for my mother, was very much, she experienced that as a movement of national liberation, right? This is here as a redress to the, anti-Semitism. And my mother experienced it. I mean, she now says she doesn't remember this, but she is 89. And she told me all the time I was growing up, stories of growing up in Baltimore. And they were poor. Her father owned a not very successful candy store in a non-Jewish neighborhood. So she grew up in a non-Jewish neighborhood, and she had the experience. She had plenty of friends, but she also had a lot of anti-Semitic experience, including a teacher in a public school who, in front of all of her non-Jewish classmates, stood her up and said, just want you to know that her people killed Christ. So as you can imagine, this led to a fair number of ass whoopings, or the social correlate to that.
Carrying on 2,000 years of a fine tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. Why should it be
any different now?
Yeah, it's worked so well for so long. For so many.
She should have yelled back, it was an accident. He hit his head on the curb.
Right, yeah. Or as Lenny Bruce would say, it was a party. It got out of hand. I don't know. Anyway, so she didn't really speak about it in those terms, but all that was there, right? And so she had a very well-developed sense, I think, of social justice that for her ran through her Zionist roots, which were very important to her, left-wing, like kibbutz Zionists, changing the world. Interestingly, many years later, she flipped and became a fairly ardent anti-Zionist in her mind for the same reasons.
Right.
And my father, I think I actually never asked him, I never really understood his own roots of Zionism. I mean, he was in the Second World War. He enlisted when he was too young to get away from his parents, he said, at 17, and saw like the very end of action in the Philippines. And I think it was in the period, and it was part of the Army of Occupation in Japan. It was in the period after that when he was on the first, on unemployment insurance that they gave soldiers when they came back. And he spent all of his time, he lived in Queens with his parents, and he spent all of his time going to Broadway shows and hang out on 52nd Street and listening to jazz. And something in that period sparked his social conscience, because he didn't grow up with it, for sure. And even if you look at photo albums of pictures he took when he was part of the Army of Occupation to Japan, there are some, casually racist names for different Japanese folks. So, you can see that he was not beyond that, but then something woke up in him.
Yeah, I mean, the whole society had names for Germans and Japanese people that, we grew up as kids watching war movies with all those epithets hurled about as if they were nothing. What do you think there was something about jazz
I don't know, maybe
for your father?
Well, he never talked about it until I got into jazz. It wasn't until, it wasn't like something that he was into music. They were both very, creative or wanting to be creative. I mean, there were creative people, no question, because they lived outside of kind of the normal mainstream. My mother was actually a dancer. But I'm just going to jump back for a sec to say, I would say that that there was definitely, whether it was thought through or not, there was definitely partial root in Judaism and their social conscience and their desire for change. And I'm pretty sure my mother translated whatever was, messianic in her upbringing. I don't mean in terms of being a messianic Jew, just in terms of the Messiah aspect of the Mashiach aspect of Judaism. What she learned, she was not uncommonly translated that into secular social action. And I would say for both of them, there always was a strong cultural, they recognized the importance of the cultural component there.
That's so interesting, because they had such a passion. I mean, both of them sound like they didn't just do life, they did it passionately.
Yes. And they really, and they really, I just can't stress enough, if I think about my life, and my brother's life, they modeled living what you believe, right? And it wasn't so much that they said, you should do whatever in your life, you should do whatever you want. They just did that and, made choices that were not about career specifically, more about what could they do to further their beliefs in the world and what they thought should happen.
So how does that manifest itself in your life?
Well, I feel like in some ways when I first decided to be a musician, I had a kind of struggle to justify it to myself, because I guess the message or inherent message in my parents' lives was, you must fight for social change. You must fight for justice. You got this is what is essential in life. Somehow at a certain point, they didn't say this to me, but I translated to that, music is frivolous, or it's not going to help anybody who's suffering directly. It's, it's for what I want. So there was a bit of that, but I certainly, think in ways that made them less than happy once I was a young adult. I always lived, have always lived based on my sense of what was right to do, right? What I was called to bring into the world, I think. Although I didn't necessarily think of it that way when I was younger, but, just to follow the thread of my story, and the story being a question of what is it mine to do in the world. So that's how I would say it now.
Right.
And, after being I already had started to see this, because as you know, although my intention was just to set out and be the best trumpet player I could be, and, a combination of circumstance, interest, and also the fact that I didn't start really playing seriously until I was 20, and I never went to university, and I was kind of self-taught, although with incredible private teachers. I had a long period where I was kind of making a living and studying on my own at the same time. So somehow that, not having a direct sort of quick line into just getting a whole bunch of work playing the trumpet, led me to do a whole bunch of different things. So for years I've been organizing stuff. Like I created the Ashkenaz Festival,
Right.
Envisioned, and then with a lot of help, created the Ashkenaz Festival, which is still running. I mean, I guess it's going to be canceled, but it was coming up on its 25th year this year.
So that's a festival of Jewish culture, which I've always taken great offense to.
I know, because of the name.
Because there's no Sephardim in there. It's just Ashkenazis as Jews.
Except that from the very beginning, there always were Sephardim. But leave it. Let's leave that one for now.
Granted, but still.
Let's leave that.
It's like people with my parents going, you don't speak Yiddish. It's like, well, what doesn't come in handy in North Africa to speak Yiddish?
Exactly.
It's not the way it works.
I'll just say this. And actually, there was a woman, who I'm going to blank on her first name now, of course, but prominent Sephardic artist, in a thing that in a way moved me more than almost anything I can think of that happened around the festival, got in touch with me because she felt exactly the same way. And she was really struggling with it because she thought it was a really good festival. And yet for her, it replicated all of the experience she had of being invisible,
Right.
growing up in
Right.
Canada, and which I completely understood.
Yeah.
And all I could say then, and I wasn't even in my defense, I wasn't trying to defend myself, I was just trying to explain where it came from, was that for me, that's what the focus was, right? Like it came out of the burgeoning renaissance of Yiddish culture. So it was a festival of new Yiddish culture. And
Yeah.
I never felt like there was anything to apologize for. It's just what it was. I never said at the beginning, right? Because at the beginning you start with a focus. I never said we're doing a festival of pan-Jewish culture. It didn't have Sephardic in it. It didn't have Mizrahi.
Oh no,
It
it's
didn't have.
it's the blind spot of the dominant culture in anything that
Well,
that
and
you
well,
don't see. Like we growing up in Toronto
yeah,
as Moroccans,
yeah.
we were never asked to be part of any association of Jewish associations at the time. We didn't really exist. Which,
That's what I was gonna say. Did you
but
exist?
well, we didn't exist
Yeah,
to people, even though we had
yeah,
over 100 families right from the beginning.
yeah.
But then we kept growing. But I actually, once I'd gone to Israel, felt better about the fact that people in North America didn't know what to do with us because they were certainly not treating us well in Israel.
Right. So
Right?
if they had noticed you were there, it would have been a lot worse.
Exactly. It would have been like, okay, these guys aren't us. And instead, it was, the conversation was, I turned to a friend on the way to school and say, "Do you like olives?" And they go, "Olives? No." I go, "What do you mean no? Like, what do you eat?" And they go, "Pickles." I go, "Oh, okay. In my house, we eat olives. Like,
It always comes down to food.
well, yeah, Mediterranean diet,
That's
like
right.
and Middle Eastern diet. So yeah, there's that always that piece. But that even within Ashkenazic Judaism, there's 18 branches of the tree.
Right.
So
That's right.
it can
Well,
get
and
very confusing for some.
well, and my choice at the time was to uh was to stay with, it was called Ashkenaz, and to focus on that, this renaissance that was happening, and at the same time to just begin to include everything from the pan-Jewish and non-Jewish world. Like in the very first festival, I had a project that included Simon Shaheen, this great Palestinian oud and violin player, doing a kind of collaboration with a Jewish musician. So
Okay, so in that
let's
first
move
one,
on.
that no, because that's a
Yeah,
tripwire, right?
yeah,
Because you have well, first of all, you're married to a Palestinian woman, so uh, you have never shied away, in my seeing of
yeah,
you, of saying, this isn't about us against them. This is us. We're all us.
yes,
And even in all the kinds of musics that you've put together, your point seems about humanity, not about tribe, even
right,
though you come in a very strong way from tribe,
yes,
right? So
yes.
talk to me about that mix.
Okay, well, that's the core of it, I think, because um, I'll just back up and say, for some reason that there's no reason at all, it just happens to be how I was made. I've always been fascinated in general by people's stories, like the really um, beautiful, dense, kind of complex stories of people's lives. And also, I always had a sense in some intuitive way about the importance of the ancestral line, right? Of being connected into the past of who we each are, right? So my own personal thing, and so I was the one always, not always. Sometimes I wish I did it a lot more, but there were many examples of me being the one sitting down with my grandparents and pushing them to tell me things. And I even at one point we had a real tape recorder, and I taped my grandfather, and of course the tape is gone, which I'm terribly
Yeah.
sad about. But
Yeah.
because I mean, maybe this comes out of the fact that, like a lot of immigrants to North America, the value, it was understood that the value was going to be found in shedding who you were as quickly as possible, right? To be able to
Right.
assimilate. So that
Avalon. You know the movie
Yes,
Apple? Yeah,
exactly,
Barry
exactly.
Levinson. I asked
Thank you for
Levinson,
that. Yes, thank
right?
you for
Because
that reference. Yes,
right, so Baltimore Avalanche. So
uh,
I asked Levinson, why is it that you never overtly say anything about these people being Jewish during the interview that I did
yeah,
with him? And we ended up in a big argument because I was really offended
yes,
that these people are cutting the turkey and freaking out.
exactly. You cut the turkey. The
That's
man
right.
is saying, "You cut the turkey." It's
Yeah,
obviously supposed to be Passover, right?
yeah.
That's what it was. Yeah,
But it's American Thanksgiving. It's this. It's that.
right,
But everything was about being an American, not
right,
about being a Jew. And I just
right,
thought you're hiding under the bushel. So we had a big
right.
fight about that
Yeah.
one.
So that, but my point is that I was always interested in people's stories, and I was interested in the ancestral story, and yet I was completely um, enraptured starting at the age of 14. I mean, before that, I think growing up in all kinds of music, and especially first in folk blues and then jazz. And, to the degree where to me this felt like that's where my life would have to be, is
Hmm.
somehow in this form. It spoke to me so deeply and powerfully, and that has never stopped doing that in a way that feels completely native, in a sense, to who I am. So that's an interesting, and that was long before I'd ever really heard klezmer music, right? It wasn't around when I was a kid.
Right.
I not consciously, it was there, like in the
So
fringes,
how
but
did you connect to it? How did
well,
I'm going to play one of your songs in a second
okay, okay.
from the
I'll
Baldwin
get to that in
album.
a sec, but I want to try and answer your question because it seems like central to so much of what
Yeah.
I do, which is, so we've got, a strong cultural Jewish consciousness I have growing up that
Right.
is tied from the very beginning to social change, sometimes in opposition to social change, but often at the center of it. I have parents who we do Shabbos every Friday, we go to shul, and they're out there trying to change the world, often uh, in collaboration with African Americans, who are a very important part of the social circle, who also then are the carriers and creators of this incredible music tradition and cultural tradition that I get exposed to somewhat directly. And then once we move here, just by listening to recordings and going out to hear people play. And somehow all of that begins to create this awareness. And then my interest in people's stories, it begins to create an awareness that there is this nexus in a human being that is between the place of their core story, which is the ancestral line,
Hmm.
and which generally is closer to being monocultural. Way less true now, way less true in Canada. If you look at my kid or many of her friends, they're all from mixed traditions, but I'm from an Ashkenazic Jewish tradition. Like you're from a Sephardic or Moroccan Jewish, your lineage. That's kind of what
Yeah.
it is, right?
Yeah.
Going back generations. So, and that is a profound anchor because you're in this stream of that story, right? And once you
Right.
have kids, you understand that it doesn't end with you. You're just one part of this whole long thing. You have to relate to that in some way. And I think people who choose not to relate to that do it at their own, they lose from that fact, right? By having no relationship to that part of their story. But then there's the part of you that intersects, in your everyday life and in your cultural life with the rest of the world. And so you have open to you the stories of all of humanity. And of course, because underneath the cultural uh, uh, strata of who you are is incredibly important and central, I think, even if it's a mixed culture, mixed background. But there's someone below that. There's the fundament, and the fundament is the human, right? It's what does it mean to be in a body on this planet with that energy field that we call a soul and a spirit, and a relationship to wider creation, and a relationship to human history and into the land and all these things. And we all share that in common, and we all create music, and we all create culture, and we all create language, and we all create ritual. So clearly we have way more that connects us than separates us. And in fact, the stuff between our cultures that is different or is diverse is just a greater enrichment. And without getting into, for this moment, into the question of cultural appropriation or any of that stuff, just to say that that I found that being rooted in the first, in some sense, helps open the rest of it to me, and that there's a relationship between the two that is a conversation that can go on forever. And so, I've done so many things. I've been identified as a Jewish artist for so long, and from the very beginning, I never liked it because not because it was wrong in a sense. I've obviously been involved in Jewish culture, but because to me, in many people's minds, there's a limitation there, because that is a thing that separates and puts me or anyone else. You've done a lot of stuff that's Jewish. If they look at you and go, yeah, Benmergui is Jewing it up again, right? That doesn't really take into account of the complexity of who you are or what you're interested in or what you're even dealing with, right?
Yeah, so one river, many wells, right? Like there's just a whole bunch of ways to get to the fundament, as you called it, underneath things. But some of us find a specific practice helps us to build a better well to get to that river underneath.
Exactly.
And that's what we do.
Yes, and there's something really important about the specificity and also the resonance that you get with generations of people who've done the same practices, right? We do a Seder. We're not just benefiting from the form of the Seder, which is so beautiful and kind of open, but also very specific. It's also the fact that, one, when we're doing that Seder, people around the world are also doing it, and also that it's been done for 2,000, 3,000 years, right?
Right. So the other part of it, there's something else I wanted, like the other part of it is then you marry someone who is not Jewish,
right,
and who politically, it's always fun for you to be able to say, and this is my wife, Rula, she's Palestinian, and watch people's confusion.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
At times I've been dying to tell people that this is Rula, she's Palestinian, this is David, he's Jewish.
Yeah.
So by doing that, you tweak the story, you tweak the ancestral thread, right? You do.
What do you mean by tweak?
Well, now there's you and her with different ancestral threads together,
right?
And then you have a child, and then that child is the child of those threads coming together.
Right.
So there's this illusion we have of purity of race, even though Jews are not a race.
Excuse me, fuck that.
Right, exactly. But the other part of that is we don't accept the hybrid nature of who we are, that we're all mutts.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So that when we see it lived, we think, no, you're not supposed to do that. And you say, but you trying to tell me that Ukrainian Jews look like Ukrainians out of a coincidence? They married other people who weren't Jewish, who were Ukrainian Catholics. That's how it works, right?
Yeah, exactly. And all the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Polish Jews. And,
yeah, exactly. All right, listen, I want to play a piece of music.
Okay.
One of the Bulgar pieces. Which one do you want to play?
Well, I'll ask you. Do you want something that is faux traditional or much more contemporary, kind of interesting intellectual take on something Jewish?
Well, that's the one I want. The second one.
Yeah. Okay, so play. You'll like the title. This one is called "The Poets." They're all Yids.
David Buchbinder, The Poets, they're all Yids. The Flying Bulgar Klezmer Band, now the Flying Bulgar Band.
shouted at the poet, are you one of us? One of us. No one's rose opening for no one. He is banished, blooming red as rust. Leaning out on the edge of life, living in a cloud of language dust. Shibboleth shouted at the poet, are you one of them or one of us, or one of us? Feed him black milk at night, scoop him out a grave from endless sky. Find solace in the crash of words. He shoots bullets from a gentle eye. With his books he stands outside. Shibboleth shouted at the poet, are you one of us? One of us. One of us. One of us.
The Flying Bulgar Band and
No, it's the Flying Bulgar. It's called the Flying Bulgar Klezmer Band.
Still? I thought you
it doesn't
took that
even-
out.
Yeah, I did for a while, but you know what? Like it doesn't. We haven't done anything except
Okay,
for
I'm trying to
30th
keep up.
anniversary.
I'm trying to be
Yeah,
nice.
I know. Who knows? But
Who'd have thunk?
now that especially in this world where we can't perform live, one of the things I'm going to eventually get to is to start pumping that music out again, because
Oh.
a lot of it, especially the later stuff, nobody's heard, or very few people have heard. And I want to both get it out there because there's still a massive amount of interest, and also monetize it a little bit.
They're all Yids. The poets, they're all Yids. Is it good for the Jews? That's a big question. Is it good
for the poets?
Is it good for the poets? Because the
Are the
poets are
poets
all
good for the Jews?
Well, I always hated when somebody would start naming how many Nobel laureates were Jewish, just to prove, what wonderful people we were. And I just think you're missing the point. This is not exceptionalism.
Right.
We are peoples among people. And I remember being in Israel doing a documentary, and I was interviewing a guy in a West Bank settlement who had a radio show, a guy from Michigan. They're all from Michigan. And this guy was,
Brooklyn.
Yeah, well, that's Jerusalem, but these guys are out in the sticks, so near Modine somewhere. So I'm doing the thing with this guy, and he says, the idea, I don't know why they're talking, but the idea is you have to come back. You have to come back. You have to come home. You have to come home. You're not really being a Jew if you don't come home. And I said, well, I actually don't see it that way. I think one of the greatest gifts of being a Jew is our diaspora, is that we have been in all these cultures around the world. That we've learned from all these people. Yes, some of them have really tried to murder us, and some of us succeeded. But that's not the only thing that happened. We also had an influence of the world and had an influence in the world. So when you started doing Diasporic Genius, I found that to be a very interesting extrapolation of so many of the things that I think you believe in, where you really wanted explain that concept, because I loved that concept right from the beginning.
Okay, well, that was where I was headed when we were talking about my parents' influence, because the thing I was going to say was that finally, when I started that about 10 years ago, and I will explain it in a sec, I realized I'd gone directly into my father's business. Because in a way, even though my father, for a lot of his working life, was a university professor, his true gift, and I think the place where he lived the most, was as an organizer. And he did do a lot of community organizing work, like I said previously, in the anti-poverty programs, and in his kind of, anti-war work. and then when he came to Canada, that's a whole another fascinating thing, the work that he did here until he became a prof at York. And even at York, he was the guy who organized the union, the faculty union. So I realized, oh, I'm actually now in community organizing, and no matter how hard I tried not to, I've also gone into my father's business. So, but what was Diasporic Genius? Diasporic Genius, in a way, the concept still exists. The organization doesn't really, it's sort of dormant. But for about 8 years, I began to work with the idea that the power of creativity could be marshaled in a way that might be transformative for not just artists, but for communities, and could have an impact literally down to the level of how we build our cities, to through the power of community organized creativity, to activate both the people in the space to become much more richly supportive of a powerful and engaged community life, right? And that one of the things that we were missing in North America and in Canada was both the physical and, in a way, like the energetic presence of the town square, the city square, the agora, the place where all roads would intersect, where ideas, people, businesses, culture would ferment, because there was the connection of all the different people there. And if you look at our cities, if we ever had them, we've destroyed all of our kind of squares. And certainly, the ones that happen within communities, right, where people are not just the downtown kind of spaces that people might go to for a festival or something, but ones where life happens, right? The ones in North Africa where a guy sits at a crossroads with a jar of olives and starts selling them, and then another guy comes up because he's got some wheat to sell, and he sells that, and a woman comes with some cloth, and now somebody starts making coffee. You know what I mean? And within several generations, you've got some buildings built up, and there are regular caravans coming through and all this stuff, right? Ideas come through, and food comes through, and all this stuff is in change and ferment, and is being enriched by the interrelationships, and by one thing by new ideas being sparked. Okay, so that all sounds a bit removed, but once I started to pull on the thread of what is the power of creativity as applying to everyday life and beyond the scope of artists, and what does that, in terms of people being able to work with the creative principle in their own lives, whether they're new immigrants or people trying to create something new for their community, or even a new business, or a center of app development, doesn't matter. What would happen if we got that happening? And secondly, what does it mean in a country like Canada, which is the most diverse, or a city like Toronto, the most diverse city on the planet? Canada now becoming one of the most diverse countries on the planet. What happens when you put that incredible influx of culture together with freeing up and supporting people and using their creative faculties to create something new, right? So it's really about, in a way, creating the structure and the tools to help people do something that happens naturally over 50 or 100 years. You still with me? So if that's the case, then the question is, what do we actually have in this city? What is the resource that exists in the city? Because we don't just have me, Ashkenazic Jewish background, growing up in the States, you, Moroccan parents. Were you born here in Morocco?
No, born in Morocco.
Born in Morocco. So born in Morocco, come here, you've had a very particular work life, creative life, partly because it's different from everybody else's, stand-up comic, broadcaster, producer, blah, 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 radio dude. And you bring a particular perspective and knowledge base, and it is not separate from what you are carrying, right? You've used what you are carrying
Yeah.
from who your parents are, and
Yeah.
like as people, but also culturally, right? As I have, as everybody else does. And the thing is that I began to realize is that people are carrying all of this untapped knowledge. And this is as true for somebody, a farmer from Wawa, Ontario, as it is from, like a mother and, home creator from Afghanistan. It doesn't really matter, or a molecular biologist from Hyderabad or whatever, right?
Right.
Or
They bring themselves with.
but what themselves contains is a
Right.
world, right? It is
Right.
a universe that has knowledge about everything that we need to know. So there's, of course, their training, there's their cultural background, there's their religious background, but there's also their lived experience of what works, right? One of the things I've become aware of more, the longer I've lived, aware of, is the way that we think that we're perceiving stuff with our mind, right? That our mind is what makes sense of everything. My experience is that the most important information comes through through our bodies, right? And that there is a knowledge of what works that involves your entire system. So if you walk into public space, if you walk into a public space, compare walking into, I don't know, even the Eaton Center, which is actually more beautiful than a lot of malls, say, or one of those glass and steel canyons downtown. Walk down one of those streets in your mind and compare it of walking through, the Shuk in Jerusalem, or, what's it called in Fez, the big market there?
Medina.
The Medina.
The old city.
Yeah. Walk through that. Walk through a piazza in Italy.
Yeah.
Or a market in West Africa. Compare these things. Compare, and you'll note, or what it's like to drive through any Canadian suburb where it is plastic and concrete and endlessly replicated, ugly chain things that you can't even tell where you are. There's no specificity.
Yeah.
So all that to say, you're perceiving all of that through your body, and there's a body knowing that tells us when we're in a space that is life-giving or life-sucking. And that is something that is shared by every human being and every human culture. And it's one of thousands of, you could call it, data points that we all know something about. So and it's practical, this is not just some idea, it's practical, because if we're looking at building a space that supports creativity, that supports commerce, that supports human and social connection, that supports interaction between groups, whether it's cultures, languages, religions, genders, age, whatever, right? And supports those interrelationships, we all know something about what that takes. If we pay attention to what the richness that lives inside of us and the culture that we're carrying with us, if we know how to access that, it becomes raw material of creating something new. And that's true whether it's public space, how to make a community business work, how to deal with social services. Like, there's a knowledge that we all have that relates to this stuff.
I keep thinking, even though I never met your father, that I'm hearing part of your father right now.
I think you are. I think you're hearing my father 2.0, in a sense that he clearly had skills and interests and experience I don't have. But I would say that he might have understood some of this intuitively. Like, I've expanded the scope, because his thinking process was very political.
Yes, but he was, as a professor, and then as an organizer, and as a Jew, and all these other things.
Yeah.
He didn't, like you, he didn't decide there was one label and I better stick to it, and everybody will get confused if I don't just keep telling them I'm this thing.
Right. No question. No
And
question.
that's so much you to me. Is
Yeah.
that it's just like, yeah, like I play a mean trumpet. Like, let's not kid ourselves. I really put a lot of work into this thing.
Yeah.
And you play beautiful music with great musicians, but there's this other yearning in there that we all are in this together. And I've
Yes.
got to find a way to help us get in this thing together. Now, some people would argue, oh, just play the music. That'll make people feel like they're in it together. But sometimes to me, that music can be a moment, a very nice spiritual moment that people can get listening to something. But it's not a sustainable community of people coming together in ritualized fashion to create something bigger and better than themselves.
That's right.
Right?
Yes. And I'll say, to jump to the present, that in a way, I've kind of discovered a place that for me, uh, in a specific way, it has all that more than anywhere I've ever been, and that's New Orleans.
How'd that
Uh,
happen?
how did it happen that I went there, or that?
Or that this has become this thing for you?
Oh well, it became this for me because I went there. I mean, there a little more than a year ago, I was actually part of a project that was nominated for a Grammy called Yiddish Glory, and the organizers of that project were really generous and sort of received the nomination in a way that allowed the artists who were part of it to be included, right? Because they could have made it, well, just the producer is going to be involved or we're going to get the artists involved. And they chose to get the artists involved. So that meant that we were all invited. And I took my daughter, who loves music, and we went there. And we had a great time. And I was originally supposed to go visit my nephew in Northern California afterwards. I'd already bought my daughter a ticket home. And then that fell through because it turned out he wasn't going to be there. And so I had 4 days I had blocked aside, blocked off. And I thought, where am I going to go? And I was a Toronto, well, he was Toronto based for about 10 years, named Chris Butcher, trombone player, who co-founded the Heavyweights brass band, really great musician. And he's been in New Orleans for 3 or 4 years. And we had done stuff together, and I was sitting in with his band a bunch, and he said, you got to come to New Orleans because you're going to really dig it. And so this was my opportunity. So I went there it was the period leading up to Mardi Gras of 2019. And it blew my mind. Like it was like, oh, this is fucking heaven. Excuse me. Like this is, like this is like the place I've always been looking for in a sense, because it's got street culture, right? You experience the parade because, people get the wrong idea that Mardi Gras is one day. It's like 2.5 months.
Right.
No, a month and a half. It starts around January 8th and goes until like late February. And there's an increasing amount of stuff going on, parades and second lines and mini festivals and, events and balls and all this stuff. So I experienced Crew de Vue, which is one of the, which has a component called Crew de Jus. There's quite actually strong Jewish presence there in some of these celebrations. It's really nice. But the thing that I immediately got was, this is what I have been dancing around for my whole life, and here it is in a place where it is living. So what was the most important thing to me when I created the Ashkenaz Festival was the Ashkenaz Parade, was getting people into the street in a participatory way, right? That's the thing I've always been interested in. Yes, I love being an artist on stage and, sharing my own creation and my colleagues' creation where people are sitting and listening and receiving it. And I like, the good reviews or whatever. The sort of response in that sense of being a professional, but really the thing that gets my insides going the most is when everybody is doing it, when everybody's participating. And there was, I did a lot of work even in the Ashkenaz Festival to try and make it like that. So here I am in a place where everybody knows the tunes in a sense, in the widest sense of that, right? Everybody knows the tunes, everybody knows the moves, it's part of everyone's life. And it isn't even just leading up to Mardi Gras. I begin to realize it goes on all year, and it's something that is woven into the fabric of the place. So, so partly because as it happens, I'm on this strange I was on this strange quasi sabbatical for about 8 months it allowed me to go to New Orleans for last May and June. And then I really started to get a sense of the place. And I was fortunate enough to get connected with the Treme Brass Band, which is one of the iconic black brass bands. And the black brass band tradition is really the core of the New Orleans jazz tradition. So it really began opening my eyes to what this culture was and how woven it was into everybody's life, and to experience jazz for the first time as a folk music, like a living folk music that is clearly rooted and, like given its spark from the African American community, but which is also about what people like to call the gumbo of New Orleans life. So for me, it was has been a profoundly spiritual experience to just hang with and play with and listen to and dance to this music that is alive for people, right? Because every single Sunday in the Black community, pretty much, there is a second line, which evolved out of the funeral tradition, but now is its own thing. And it's like a 3 or 4 or 5 hour parade with up to thousands of people, with large brass band or brass bands, with sort of the featured dancers people can see who are in costume and are dancing. And then everybody, old, young, kids, seniors, people in wheelchairs, people running, young people showing off, people dancing like crazy and drinking, and guys pulling their kids' wagons full of beer and ice that they're selling, just like, and old ladies selling food by the side. It's just the most organic. It is like a very specific take on diasporic genius, right?
Yeah.
It is the public sphere full of life that is driven by the grassroots and can't be owned, and persists in the face of everything, incredible racism, poverty. Like it's tearing me up inside that across America in general, but especially in New Orleans, that the vast majority of the people who are dying from COVID-19 are Black.
Yeah. Because
of all the comorbidities and centuries
and vulnerability.
Vulnerabilities.
Climate change.
Yeah. All that stuff.
Will there be a New Orleans in 15
years?
Well,
the thing is, who knows? The thing is that it's amazing that it came back after Katrina, and there are all kinds of challenges. And there has been gentrification and Airbnbism and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Which on a certain level, people are saying, this is fucking up these traditional neighborhoods, but it doesn't go away. Like, people are doing it, and the kids there, it is being passed on. There are so many young people who are right in there playing the brass band music, and for whom it is not like the thing that happens in every other culture is, oh, that's the old fogey shit. I don't have anything to do with that. That's not what, I'm sure there's some of that in New Orleans, but there's enough people for whom this is like lifeblood. And it means that these are people with incredible dignity and incredible self-possession, I feel like, because their culture is so strong. And it is the music and the celebration, but it's also just their sense of who they are and the magic of the place where their roots are. So
isn't that funny? There you were trying to create that against all odds in a high urban setting in the biggest city in the country, and then you go down there and it's like, oh look, this is what it really looks like when it comes from the ground up.
Well, and it's funny, I knew that, right? I knew it. Like, I've been aware forever about the New Orleans brass band tradition, and there's all, that was kind of a model of a thing I tried to get some funding for, and I never did, within Diasporic Genius, because I didn't say this, but we were working, most of our work was done in Thorncliffe Park.
Right.
A sort of just close suburb neighborhood of Toronto, which is the most diverse neighborhood in North America. So, and we did a lot of festivals and stuff that involved parading around and, the street, trying to bring some feeling of the street. So I was very aware of that model. I just hadn't experienced it directly.
Yeah.
I knew what it was. I knew the vibe. I knew the history. But to actually, taste it and touch it, kind of feel it in that way has been really profoundly, I don't know if it's transformative, but it's just deepened something. And not surprisingly, I have, I partly through this sort of sabbatical action, and also now in this period of enforced like solitude, I am diving back into this. I have been diving, and now I'm even further diving into the study of jazz in a way I haven't done in years. And I think I might finally, be imbibing the core, because the thing that playing with these guys in New Orleans did for me is to teach me the core, the root, like the base of the feel of the rhythmic,
Right.
the rhythmic approach to this music that is behind all subsequent jazz.
Wow. Isn't it lovely getting older?
Jesus, man. I'm like, I keep going like, when's that time going to come where I'm like sitting on the rocking chair? I don't see it. I don't see it coming anytime soon,
No, but it ain't a rocking chair. That's the beauty of it. It's a synthesized wisdom. It's cultivating the experience of your life.
Yeah.
All those things you've described in this hour together, it's almost like it's the logical conclusion would have been the epiphany in New Orleans.
Right.
And then the deepening of your own already very high level of, yes, your skill is very high, your feeling is very high, and now you feel like you've added a spiritual Lego piece here that makes the thing work. You know?
No, and that makes me, well, I mean, I've always been somebody who always feels like I'm just starting out.
Good.
So now I still even more feel like I'm just starting out.
Well, that's the Buddhist thing, the beginner mind, right?
Is that a thing?
You always have to have the beginner's mind. Not once we feel like we know things,
right?
We stop listening.
Yeah.
And we go, no, that's not how you do it. That's not how you play that riff. Play it like this.
Yeah.
Instead of just, what's my beginner's mind? I'm playing this riff for the first time this day, this moment. Right?
Yeah. And there's so much to look forward to because there's so much to learn. There's so much to learn. And I feel like that is totally alive in the New Orleans vibe, right? They have a profound respect for their elders there. That makes me feel young because they're guys in their late 70s, early 80s laying it down. Like, and they don't have any interest or desire or pretensions to do something innovative. They want to freaking inhabit that groove like their ancestors did and as deeply as they can. And
I introduced the Preservation Hall Jazz Band at the Montreal Jazz Festival once for CBC Radio. And I looked at these guys and I thought, how in hell did they come up here to do this gig? They're 83 years old, 87 years old, 91 years old. And then the next time they came, 3 of them were missing.
Right. Well,
they passed away, and there were some younger guys who were 75 years old in the band. And I just thought, this is a way of life. This isn't a gig. This is
and there's
how they live.
There's a thing you get to, right? There's a thing you get to, like the Treme Brass Band. The leader is a guy named Benny Jones, who also he's a very important dude, and he's probably in his late 70s. I'm worried about him, I have to say, all those cats. But I was in touch with his sort of second in command, Vernon, yesterday, who told me he was having a good time drinking some beers and Jack Daniels with his childhood friend who I met, who they call the governor. And he said everybody's all right. But, Benny Jones has been doing this since he was 5.
Right.
And he's 80, and his groove is unassailable. And you could never notate. I mean, it's true of any kind of great music, but it is so astounding what he does, the magic that he creates with no effort, right? He sits on a stool and just like he hardly moves, and it like moves the entire room. And
I love when people do stuff like that. There was a guitarist I used to be in this horrible cover band, and we had a really good guitarist for a while. And the first time he played with us, I was hearing this incredible lead, and I'm looking around the stage because there were 2 guitarists, and I'm thinking, who's doing that? And one guy's, pounding away on rhythm, and I realized it's the other guy, and he hasn't moved a muscle in 10 minutes, and he is just killing it, absolutely killing it.
Well, and I think that goes up the older you get. Like I think of this, I spent 3 weeks a number of years ago in Havana on a research trip, and ended up falling in with this guy who was a music promoter. We spent some days together. Anyway, through him, I went to hear Septeto Habanero, which was, they were part of the number of bands like in the 30s who created son, which is the core
Right.
of all Afro-Cuban dance music. And some of these guys, these were younger guys who probably came in the 40s or 50s or whatever, but they were in their 80s. And the bass player looked like a combination of a pear and a bulldog. And he was sitting on, he was sitting on a tall stool, a bit kind of slumped like this. He looked like he was about to melt into the ground, and you couldn't see his fingers move, but he lay down the heaviest tumbao, like rhythmic bass part I've ever heard in my life.
Great. Fantastic.
So we have something to look forward to, Ralph.
Yeah, well, God willing. Let's play one piece of music on the way out the door, something from Odessa, Havana.
Yeah, well, actually, this is perfect segue because unlike a lot of the Odessa Havana, which is a project that is a combination of the compositional approach of myself and Hilario Duran, who's one of the great living Cuban piano players and composers, and we're lucky to have him in Toronto. We each kind of imbibed the other's music and then began writing music that relates to the historic confluence of Afro-Cuban and Jewish music, which nobody knows about, but I discovered and is a real thing. I didn't just make it up. And so a lot of the music that you hear is very blended, and it's very hard to identify, oh, this is Jewish or it's Cuban or whatever, because it's our writing. This piece, I'm pretty sure I gave you one called A Divine, right? Is that what you got there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is actually it's the very most Cuban sounding thing on it, and it's my composition that's an homage to Arsenio Rodriguez, who's one of the, like the Septeto Habanero, he's one of the inventors of son. He was a blind tresero, played the tres in the 30s, and a band leader. And he's a guy who blew past boundaries because at the time, Afro-Cubans weren't allowed to play in public for white people. And he was the first person to get through that and to be a important band leader. And he changed everything about Cuban music. So this is my homage to him, which is sort of built on a piece of his called Adivinalo, and I call it A Divine.
David Buchbinder, thank you very much. Continue to blow past the boundaries, my friend. I love what you do.
Thank you, Ralph.
And take care of yourself and your family and everyone else. And I hope you get to go back to New Orleans as soon as you possibly can for more.
Thank you.
Precious fruit.
And when we can get off the Zoom, let's see each other in the flesh.
We'll do a Shabbos together.
Okay, beautiful.
All right. You take care.
You. Okay.
Bye. David Buchbinder, Odessa, Havana, the Juno award-winning Odessa, Havana. I'm Ralph Benmergui. This is Not That Kind of Rabbi. If you want to get in touch with me, go to ralphbenmergui@gmail.com and send me a note. Tell me if you're enjoying the programming we're doing. Lots of lovely things are said about the show on Twitter and Facebook, so you can join in that way. And please subscribe if you find it of interest to you, because we love doing it and we want to create more wonderful conversations with great Canadians about interesting spiritual lives as much as we can. Take care of each other. We'll see you soon. Bye.
This podcast has been produced by TMDS and accelerated by Roam Phone. Roam Phone brings you the most reliable virtual phone service to run your business and protect your home number